It was the morning of July 2nd, 1916. A British officer stood in a muddy trench in Engelbelmer behind the lines at the Somme and called out the names of his battalion. The dawn was gray. The guns had not yet started again. The roll book in his hands had, on the evening of June 30th, listed something in the neighborhood of 800 men, officers, NCOs, riflemen, signalers, bombers, runners, the strength of a single battalion of the British Army. He read the first name. No answer. He read the second. No answer. He kept reading. When he was finished, 68 voices had answered. 68 men of the Newfoundland Regiment were left standing. The rest were lying on a torn slope of chalk between two lines of German wire, 400 yards north of the village of Beaumont-Hamel, in a small green hollow of the French countryside. They had been there for less than a single day. They had attacked at 15 minutes past 9. By 9:45, the Newfoundland Regiment, as a fighting formation, had ceased to exist. This is the story of one morning, and of what one morning did to a country. It's the story of a self-governing British Dominion of 242,000 people, a windswept island in the North Atlantic that ran on cod, codfish, and loyalty to the crown, that sent its young men 5,000 miles across the ocean to fight in a war they did not start, and lost in 30 minutes on the first morning of the Battle of the Somme the better part of the only land regiment that they had. It is the story of a regiment that was annihilated, then rebuilt, and given the rarest honor the British Army could bestow. And it's the story of how the same nation that bled at Beaumont-Hamel ceased, less than 2 decades later, to exist as a country at all. This is the story of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. In 1914, Newfoundland was not a Canadian province. It was a separate dominion of the British Empire, equal in constitutional standing to Canada itself, to Australia, to New Zealand, and to South Africa. Its capital was St. John's, a hill town of about 32,000 built around a deep harbor. Its parliament met in the Colonial Building. It had its own currency, its own postage stamps, its own flag. It was, in the imperial language of the day, an autonomous dominion of His Majesty the King. Its population, roughly 242,000 by one careful count, was scattered along thousands of miles of rocky coastline in fishing settlements called outports. 98% of them were native-born, the descendants of English and Irish settlers who had come to the island for the cod. The cod fishery was everything. It was the economy. It was the calendar. It was the reason the population existed at all. The men of the outports went to sea each spring in small boats, hauled their fish through summer and autumn, and salted what they caught for exports to the markets of Spain, Portugal, the West Indies, and Brazil. It was a society of small, intimate, closely related communities, knit together by church, by kinship, and by a shared knowledge of the sea. It was poor, it was loyal, and it was vulnerable in ways that no one yet understood. When Britain declared war on Germany on the evening of August 4th, 1914, Newfoundland was, by treaty and by tradition, automatically at war. The decision had been made for her in London. She had not been consulted. She had also not objected. The governor of Newfoundland, Sir Walter Davidson, was a vigorous imperial servant who saw an opportunity. The Dominion didn't have a standing army. The local Newfoundland constabulary kept order in St. John's, and there were militia companies attached to various denominational schools, the Catholic Cadet Corps, the Church Lads Brigade, the Methodist Guards. But there was no battalion that could be put aboard a ship and sent to France. On August 8th, 4 days after the declaration, Davidson wired the colonial secretary in London and proposed that Newfoundland raise a regiment of 500 volunteers for service overseas. His message was approved. The work would now have to be done. But Davidson had a problem. The colony had no military department capable of raising a regiment, so he handed off the task to civilians. The Newfoundland Patriotic Association, a private body of merchants, clergymen, and politicians, took on the entire burden of recruiting, equipping, paying, and dispatching the country's contribution to the war. On August the 22nd, an enlistment proclamation appeared in the newspapers, addressed to the men between 19 and 35, calling them to serve abroad for the duration of the war, but hedging slightly for not more than 1 year. You can think about that for a minute. Do the math in your head. For the duration of the war, but not more than a year. It'll be over before that. And the response was immediate. Boys came in from Conception Bay and Bonavista Bay and the Burin Peninsula. They came from St. John's, from Carbonear, from Harbor Grace and Twillingate. By the time recruiting for the first contingent closed at the end of September, 970 men had presented themselves. 565 were accepted. The rest were rejected on grounds of age, height, eyesight, or were held in reserve. Out of an island of barely 250,000 souls, the better part of a battalion had assembled in a month. But they needed a uniform. And here, the Patriotic Association ran into one of the small, telling logistical problems that defined Newfoundland's war from the very beginning. A British soldier's uniform required putties, these long strips of woolen cloth that were wound around the calf, from the boot to the knee. The regulation color was khaki. There was no regulation khaki cloth on the island. There was, however, a quantity of dark blue wool serge held by a local supplier. The Patriotic Association ordered the putties made in blue, and the first contingent went into uniform with the distinctive blue leg wrappings that would almost immediately become a badge of honor. They called themselves the Blue Puttees. They trained on the green field at Pleasantville on the shores of Quidi Lake in St. John's, drilling under instructors who had served in the South African War a decade and a half earlier. On October 3rd, 538 of them marched down to the harbor through cheering crowds and boarded the SS Florizel, a Bowring Brothers liner more accustomed to the sealing trade than to carrying troops. The Florizel sailed in convoy with the Great Canadian transports, carrying the 1st Canadian Division to England. She put her Newfoundlanders ashore in Devonport in the second week of October. The Blue Puttees became the first separate Dominion contingent to reach the United Kingdom in the Great War. What followed was a long apprenticeship. They trained on Salisbury Plain, at Aldershot, in Scotland at Staub's Camp and at Edinburgh Castle, learning the discipline of British infantry. They were folded into the British Army's 29th Division, a regular formation made up of professional soldiers that were recalled from imperial garrisons in India, Burma, China, and Africa. And in the late summer of 1915, they sailed for the eastern Mediterranean. Their first taste of combat came not on the Western Front, but at Suvla Bay on the Gallipoli Peninsula in September of 1915. There they held the line through the brutal autumn and the freezing storms that killed nearly as many men as Turkish guns. They were among the last troops to leave when the British evacuated the peninsula in January of 1916. By the spring of 1916, the surviving Newfoundlanders had been rebuilt with reinforcements and shipped to France, where they took their place in the 29th Division on the chalk downs of Picardy. There, on a slope above a small French village called Beaumont-Hamel, they would have their second great battle. The plan belonged to Sir Douglas Haig, the British Expeditionary Forces commander. But the man at the top of the Newfoundland Regiment's chain of command on July 1st, 1916 was an artilleryman with a domed, fleshy face and a reputation for aggressive obedience. Lieutenant General Sir Aylmer Hunter Weston. He commanded 8th Corps, and 8th Corps was on the extreme left of the British line, north of the Albert-Bapaume Road. The 29th Division held the center of the Corps. Beaumont-Hamel was its objective. The strategic concept behind the Somme offensive was simple and, in conception, reasonable. The British and the French, who came together at the line near the Somme, would mount a joint offensive on a front of roughly 20 miles north and south of the River Somme. They would crush the German frontline defenses with the largest artillery bombardment in the history of warfare to that date, then walk forward across no man's land and occupy the wrecked German trenches. The whole assault was supposed to break the German line in a single sweep. The bombardment began on June 24th and ran for a week. Across the front, the British and French fired roughly 1.5 million shells. The men in the trenches, those who would have to leave them, watched the German positions disappear under a continuous rolling fog of high explosive and shrapnel. Many of them believed, with a faith that would not survive the week, that no living thing could be left in front of them when the order came. But as we know, they were wrong. The bombardment had two serious defects, and both would matter at Beaumont-Hamel. The first was that a large fraction of the British shells were shrapnel rather than high explosive. And shrapnel was effective against troops in the open, but very poor against barbed wire and deep dugouts, and the Germans had both. And the second problem was that the Germans on this part of the front had spent the better part of 2 years building their dugouts in places 40 feet deep, lined with timber. They were dry, ventilated, almost soundproof, and their men had simply gone underground for a week, eaten, slept, and waited. Beaumont-Hamel sat on a low spur. North of the village, on a slight rise called Hawthorne Ridge, the Germans had built a strong point, a redoubt of trenches, machine gun positions, and dugouts. The British plan for the morning of July 1st called for the Hawthorne redoubt to be destroyed by a mine. 40,000 pounds of ammonal explosive, packed at the end of a long tunnel dug under the German lines. The mine itself was a problem. Hunter Weston wanted it blown 4 hours before the infantry attack to give his men time to consolidate the crater under cover of the wider bombardment. The senior engineer at GHQ vetoed this on the reasonable grounds that the Germans were quicker than the British at occupying mine craters and would do so before the assault had begun. A compromise was reached. The mine would be detonated 10 minutes before 0 hour. It was a catastrophic compromise. The mine, when it blew, would warn every German in that sector of the front that the British were coming, and would lift the local barrage early, giving the German garrison 10 minutes to climb up from their dugouts, man their guns, and ready themselves. In the gathering dark of June 30th, Lieutenant Owen Steele of the Newfoundland Regiment sat in a billet at Lovincourt and wrote in his diary. He'd been writing throughout the bombardment. On June 20th, he had recorded, "There seems to be a strange pensiveness about everything, and we are all strangely thoughtful about the great push." On the 23rd, he had written, "Everyone seems so cool about it all, quietly preparing for what is going to be the greatest attack in the history of the world, and very possibly the greatest there will ever be." And on the night of June 30th, with the bombardment in its final hours, he wrote one final entry. That same evening, the battalion's strength on paper stood at 32 officers and 972 men. A draft of 66 replacements had arrived to bring up the unit to war establishment. And by Army protocol, 10% of the battalion was held back from the attack in reserve, a precaution against a regiment being wiped out completely. The rest were somewhere between 720 and 780 men, depending on which role you trust. And these were the ones who moved up that night to St. John's Road, a forward support trench that was named with what now reads as a terrible affection for their hometown. In command of them all was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lovell Haddo. Haddo was English. He was a regular officer of the Norfolk Regiment, attached to command the Newfoundlanders the previous December. He was 38 years old. He had married a young Englishwoman 3 months earlier, in April, and his fellow officers had given him a silver salver as a wedding gift, a heavy engraved plate that Haddo would carry with him in some form for the rest of his life, and would, nearly half a century later, be called his most precious possession. For the next 10 hours, the lives of the men who had marched aboard the Florizel 2 autumns before were in his hands. At 6:25 on the morning of July 1st, 1916, the final intense British barrage began. For 45 minutes, the ground in front of the 29th Division shook continuously. The men in the trenches could feel the vibration through the boards beneath their boots. At 7:20, right on schedule, the Hawthorne Ridge mine was fired. 40,000 pounds of ammonal lifted the German redoubt into the air in a fountain of chalk and earth that climbed, by some accounts, 300 feet above the rolling fields, and held its shape for several seconds before falling back to the ground. You can actually see a video recording of that explosion. It was recorded by a man named Jeffrey Malins, who was in an area that we know today as the Sunken Lane, where the men of the Lancashire Fusiliers would launch their attack very close to the redoubt. And he filmed several moments that morning, one of which was the explosion of the mine. Well, the Germans, alerted exactly as predicted, came up out of their dugouts. At 7:30, whistles blew along the line. The leading battalions of the 29th Division, which included the South Wales Borderers, the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, and, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Lancashire Fusiliers, climbed out of their trenches and walked in extended lines and at a measured pace into no man's land. What happened next is one of the most thoroughly documented disasters in the history of the British military. The German machine gunners, having ridden out the bombardment in their deep dugouts, were already in position. They opened fire from the first second. The first wave of the 29th Division was, in many places, struck down before it had even cleared its own wire. Some men reached the German lines. Here and there, a handful entered the enemy trenches. Almost none of them came back. Within an hour, in front of Beaumont-Hamel, the leading regiments of 2 brigades of the 29th Division had effectively ceased to exist. The trenches behind them, the front line, the communication trenches, the assembly bays, were now packed with the wounded crawling back and with the dead piled where they had fallen trying to climb out in the first place. These trenches were physically impassable. Reports filtering back to Hunter Weston's headquarters were confused. From a distance through the smoke and the haze, it was difficult to tell whether the attack had been successful or not. Several optimistic messages reached the Corps commander suggesting that his troops had been seen entering the German lines at Beaumont-Hamel. On the strength of those reports, Hunter Weston ordered the reserve, including the Newfoundland Regiment, with the 1st Battalion Essex Regiment alongside it, to push forward and exploit the supposed breakthrough. The order reached Lieutenant Colonel Haddo at St. John's Road Support Trench around 8:45 that morning. He could not get to the front line. The communication trenches that connected St. John's Road to the British forward positions were choked with men, the dead, the dying, the wounded, crawling to the rear in their hundreds. To move his battalion through them would have taken far too long. Haddo made the decision that has been argued over ever since. He ordered the Newfoundlanders to advance from where they were. They would climb out of the St. John's Road trench and walk an extended line across the British front, across 200 yards of open ground, through their own wire entanglements, past the British front trench, and across the better part of half a mile of no man's land into the German line. At 9:15, the Newfoundlanders rose. They were alone. The Essex, whose communication trenches were equally clogged, had not yet started. The first waves of the 29th Division were lying motionless on the slope ahead. There was no smoke. There was no covering bombardment. The German gunners, who had spent the past hour shooting at lines of British infantry hundreds of yards away, now saw a single, isolated formation rising from a trench 200 yards behind the British front line, in clear morning light, walking directly toward them. They concentrated their fire. The Newfoundlanders advanced into a converging crossfire from German machine guns, both north and south. They funneled, as they had to, through the gaps that had been cut in their own wire the previous night. The Germans had registered every one of those gaps with rifles and machine guns. The men came through them in twos and threes and were cut down where they stood. Those who got past their own wire walked on. Halfway across no man's land, on the gentle reverse slope leading down toward the German line, there stood a single tree. It had been part of an orchard or a small clump of trees once. By the morning of July 1st, 1916, it was a leafless trunk with a few twisted branches. The Newfoundlanders had used it as a landmark in trench raids earlier that spring, and they had given it the name by which it has been known for more than a century: the danger tree. I've stood at the danger tree. It's a preserved version of it. It's probably not what it was at that time, but it's marked and it's labeled, and it's one of the most sobering places I've ever stood in my entire life. I can't even begin to describe to you the weight of what I felt in standing there and knowing what that place represented, because it was the focal point of the German fire. The men of the Newfoundland Regiment fell in clusters around the tree. The danger tree, by the time it was over, marked the furthest point of the regiment's advance that morning. The entire action had lasted around 30 minutes. When the survivors crawled back through the long morning, some lying in shell holes until dark, some shamming the dead while the German fire raked over them, some crawling on shattered legs, they brought with them a question that the British medics behind the line would hear over and over again. They were brought into the dressing stations bleeding, half-conscious, broken, and most of them asked the same thing: "Is the colonel pleased? Is the colonel pleased?" Different rolls give different numbers. The most reliable figures suggest that somewhere between 720 and 780 Newfoundlanders went over the parapet that morning, and that of those, roughly 710 became casualties, a loss rate of more than 90%. 233 men were killed outright. 386 were wounded, many of them critically. 91 were missing and would eventually be presumed dead. 14 sets of brothers died that morning. 4 lieutenants from one St. John's family. When integrating the missing into the dead, we come up with a figure of around 324. The exact arithmetic varies. What does not vary is the fact that every single officer of the Newfoundland Regiment who walked into that morning's attack became a casualty. 14 were killed. 12 were wounded. The Newfoundland Regiment suffered the highest unit casualty rate in the British Army on July 1st, 1916, a morning on which the British Army as a whole suffered roughly 19,240 dead and another 35,000 wounded, the worst single day in its history. The next morning, at the battalion's billets behind the line, the roll was called. 68 men answered. Lieutenant Owen Steele was not among the dead of July 1st. He had gone over with the others, and somehow, by the strange chance that decides these things, he had come back. He survived the day. He survived July 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th. On July 7th, he was standing outside D Company's billets when a random German shell fell short of the line and exploded near him. He died of his wounds the following day. His diary, the entries his sister Ella would later transcribe and preserve, ends with the last note he made on the evening before the battle. Lieutenant Colonel Haddo lived. He commanded the regiment until January 1918, when he reverted to his original rank in the Norfolk Regiment. He went home to England, raised a family, retired from the Army, and lived in the country for the next 46 years. Until his death in January of 1964, according to his grandchildren, there was probably not one day on which he did not think of the young men of Newfoundland who had died under his command. The silver salver his fellow officers had given him as a wedding gift in April of 1916 that he came to call his most precious possession. Well, after his death, his family donated it, engraved now with the names of many of the men who had been killed under his command, and it's now in the Regimental Museum in St. John's. In Newfoundland, the news arrived in the form of a quietly devastating cable, then by the lists in St. John's papers, then by telegrams carried up paths and across coves to the doors of outport homes. There was no community on the island that did not know somebody who had been at Beaumont-Hamel. There were communities that lost half the boys of their generation in a single morning. The grief was specific, and it was nationwide. And on the field, the British Army that had sent them forward took its own measure of what they had done. The 29th Division's commander, Major General Sir Beauvoir de Lisle, would write afterward in language that has clung to the regiment for more than a century. Quote, "It was a magnificent display of trained and disciplined valor, and its assault only failed of success because dead men can advance no further." End quote. Most regiments, after losing 91% of their assault strength in a single morning, would have been disbanded, their survivors absorbed into another unit or sent home. The Newfoundland Regiment was not. It was the only land regiment of an entire country, and the country sent more men. Through the rest of 1916 and into 1917, reinforcements crossed the Atlantic. Boys who had been 14 and 15 when the Blue Puttees marched aboard the Florizel, now grown into uniform. The regiment was rebuilt. By the spring of 1917, it was back at the front, attached again to the 29th Division. They went into action on April 14, 1917 at Monchy-le-Preux during the Battle of Arras. The regiment took the village, but a powerful German counterattack threatened to retake it. A handful of Newfoundlanders, at one point by some accounts no more than a small group of officers and men under Lieutenant Colonel James Forbes Robertson, held the eastern edge of the village against the German assault until reinforcements arrived. The regiment's casualties for April 12th through 15th numbered 460, all ranks, but the line held. 7 months later, the regiment fought again at Cambrai. When the German counteroffensive in late November threatened to roll up the British advance, the Newfoundlanders stood their ground, although outflanked, and were among the units credited with stabilizing the line. In December 1917, King George V signed an order conferring on the regiment the right to use the prefix Royal before its name. It was the only British infantry regiment to receive that honor during the First World War. The official recognition came too late for most of the men of July 1st. Their boys had been royal long before there was a paper that said so. By the armistice, approximately 12,000 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians had enlisted out of a population of around 242,000. Roughly 1 in 20 of the country's total population had served. Around 1,300 had been killed. When the war ended, the people of Newfoundland did what the people of every belligerent nation did. They built memorials. In St. John's, they raised the National War Memorial on Water Street, a granite cenotaph crowned by a bronze figure of liberty, flanked by sailor, soldier, and forestry corpsmen. They placed memorial plaques in their churches. They named streets and schools after the dead. And every July 1st, and every outport, the names of the boys who had gone with the Blue Puttees and not come home were read aloud. But the great act of Newfoundland's memory was not in Newfoundland. It was in France. In the years after the war, the Dominion purchased the better part of 74 acres of the old battlefield at Beaumont-Hamel. The land they bought was the ground over which the regiment had attacked on the morning of July 1st, 1916. The British support trench called St. John's Road, the frontline trench, the cratered no man's land, the danger tree, the German line at Wysap Ravine. They left the trenches as they had been left at the end of the war, softened by rain and by time, but still there, still visible, the chalk parapets and the duckboards and the shell holes. They planted Newfoundland flora, juniper, dogberry, native shrubs around the edges. And on the high ground at the rear of the park where the Newfoundlanders had stepped off, they erected a memorial. The Beaumont-Hamel Newfoundland Memorial was dedicated on June 7, 1925. The dedication was performed by Field Marshal Earl Haig, the same Douglas Haig who had been Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force on the day the regiment was destroyed. The centerpiece of the memorial is a great bronze caribou. It's really remarkable when you visit there, and I highly recommend if you ever get the chance to visit. It was modeled by the English sculptor Basil Goddo. It stands on an outcrop of stones quarried in Newfoundland, with native shrubs planted around its base facing north. It faces the direction of the old German line. Its head is raised. Its antlers are spread. Its mouth is open, mid-bellow. It's the emblem of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment and the most recognizable symbol of Newfoundland's memory of the war. At the foot of the caribou, 3 bronze tablets carry the names of 821 Newfoundlanders, soldiers and sailors of the Great War who have no known grave. Every year, on July 1st, in Newfoundland and Labrador, 2 ceremonies take place. In the morning at the National War Memorial in St. John's and at memorials in towns and villages across the province, people gather for Memorial Day. The last post is sounded. A wreath is laid. The names of the dead are remembered. In the afternoon on the same day, Canada Day celebrations begin. Parades, picnics, fireworks. July 1st in this province carries 2 meanings: the founding of one nation and the great wound of another, and they have always been observed in that order. The wound was not only in the cemeteries and the bronze tablets. It was in the history books of the country. Newfoundland came out of the war with a public debt that cod fishery could not service. Pensions for the wounded, allowances for the widows of the dead, interest on the loans that had paid for the Florizel and the trains and the rifles. All of it had to be paid for, and the post-war collapse of fish prices made paying for it impossible. The colony staggered through the 1920s on borrowed money. When the Great Depression arrived at the end of 1929, the underlying weakness became a crisis. By the end of 1932, Newfoundland was unable to make the interest payments on its $100 million public debt. In 1933, a British Commission of Inquiry recommended that the Dominion suspend self-government. The Newfoundland legislature, the parliament that had sent men to die in France in the Great War, voted itself out of existence. On February 16, 1934, the country surrendered its responsible government and accepted in its place an unelected commission of government appointed in London. Newfoundland is the only nation in the history of the British Empire to ever have surrendered self-government voluntarily. The Second World War reversed the colony's fortunes. American and Canadian military bases at Argentia and Stephenville and Gander brought capital, employment, and modern infrastructure for the first time in a generation. And by the late 1940s, Newfoundland once again ran a surplus. But by then, the question of what kind of country it was going to be had been opened and could not be closed without a vote. In a referendum in 1948, after a bitter campaign that split families and churches, Newfoundlanders chose by a margin of fewer than 7,000 votes out of more than 140,000 cast to enter the Canadian Confederation. On March 31st, 1949, Newfoundland ceased to be a dominion of the British Empire and became the 10th province of Canada. The country that had raised the Blue Puttees and sent them to France did not survive the wound. On the high ground of Beaumont-Hamel, the bronze caribou still faces north. The old British wire is still visible in the grass. The trench called St. John's Road, where Lieutenant Colonel Haddow gave his order at 8:45 on the morning of July 1st, 1916, is still cut into the chalk. From the caribou, you can still see all the way down across no man's land to the place where the danger tree stood, and beyond it to the gentle rise where the German line ran. It's 600 yards. It took the Newfoundland Regiment 30 minutes to cross half of it. It took Newfoundland 33 years to disappear afterward. Every year, on the first morning of July, in the small green hollow in the front of the bronze caribou, someone plays the last post. The notes carry across the trenches and out into the field. The thing that the caribou remembers is not the kind of thing that draws large crowds. Not always. But the caribou remembers. And in the outports of Newfoundland, and in the towns and cities of the province that the Dominion became, so does everyone whose name appears on a roll of honor, in a church, in a school, on a granite cenotaph, on a bronze tablet, on a battlefield in France. The boys who went out with the Blue Puttees did not all come home. But the country they died for, and the country that died after them, has not forgotten that in 30 minutes on a French chalk slope in the summer of 1916, the better part of a generation of Newfoundlanders rose into a converging fire of German machine guns and walked into it as far as the danger tree, then went no further, because dead men can advance no further. Thanks for listening.